are such a genuine gem. Thank you for clicking on my video. I'm Brooke Makenna, but today's case is about an Indigenous woman who was killed by hospital staff. Now, all of us know the panic that can set in when we need help, yet the true horror is when those who can help refuse to do a thing. If you don't notice my absolute passion to tell these stories, I mean no harm or disrespect when I do so. So if that's something you would like to support me in doing, all you have to do is make sure you are subscribed with the post notification bell on, giving this video a thumbs up, and leaving a nice comment down below. Now let's get back to the story. So it was 2020 in Canada, and the Echaquan family lived in Quebec. This was 37-year-old Joyce and her husband Carol and their 7 children, one of whom Joyce had just given birth to, so he was a newborn baby boy named Carl Jr. after his father. Now the whole family belonged to the Echaquan tribe, which was a nation of Indigenous inhabitants. Now the Echaquan called their land, they were from the land of the St. Maurice River Valley in Quebec. However, the nearly 7,000 of these tribal members were now living in 3 reserves, but they would have territorial chiefs who actually knew the ins and outs of the territory and its resources, and they continued as a tribe to have these hunter-gatherer mentalities in order to protect their culture and their identity. Now this is because they were able to govern themselves as a small country while still being Canadian citizens, so they would still have to follow all of the Canadian laws. Echaquan also have their own language, and their name actually comes from the word whitefish. But most of the members have learned how to speak either French or some English in order to speak to the non-tribal members who they will come in contact with. But most of them have their native language, and they stick with that because they are in kind of this tribal community, and they don't often need to speak other languages. They were actually a tribe that remained alive and well even in 2020, many years after the Europeans had stolen the land of many Native Americans and slaughtered many in order to get the wealth of the land, to steal it and to claim it as their own. Many tribes were ripped apart throughout history. They did not survive, and those who did would suffer the consequences of surviving. You know, Joyce and Carol at this point were able to live a happy life as tribal members, and they were pretty protected in their community, and the 7 children were so extremely happy, and they were just a very loving, supportive family and tribe. That's kind of the thing with these tribes, is that family to them is the entire tribe, not just your immediate family. It hadn't always been so joyful for the Echaquan family though, because Joyce's brother had actually drowned to death, and this caused Joyce to be extremely depressed, and her grief was very hard to deal with. So she had gone to the doctor, and she had actually been put on amphetamines, and this caused her to have an addiction to that medication. And so Carol, her husband, quit his job as a firefighter to start helping take care of the children during this time. But since then, Joyce had actually overcome her addiction, and the family was, back to normal. They were extremely happy, and they were all healthy as well. After this, Joyce had found a passion, a love in filming her life and the life of her kids, and she was literally always recording every little thing that they did. She had a Facebook page, and she would post it on there no matter what it was. I mean, she would eat jelly candies in bed. She would wear head-to-toe camouflage and show her outfits. She would watch her daughters play video games. You could tell on camera that she was so obsessed with her kids. She would call them her best friends, and she was always hysterically laughing when they were around, and she was just a ball of energy and sunshine.
Joyce Echaquan filmed everything. The important things. Memories to be cherished forever. Others, not so much. An 18th birthday. Her family. Her children. And her husband, Carol, who always made her laugh. The Echaquan family's lawyer granted APTN exclusive access to these videos to remind the public of Joyce's life.
There's one of Joyce screaming as she actually caught a fish from the creek. She also loved to make moose meat stew for the entire family, and she adored all kinds of animals. In fact, animals were her next biggest love to her children, and so every occasion from birthdays to different holidays were filmed for future memories, and they were posted on this Facebook for other members of the tribe and their family to be able to see. She sung loudly to her children. She adored every moment she had with them. Unfortunately, she would not have many moments left, and she had no idea. You see, on September 26th of 2020, Joyce would admit herself into the Lauderdale Hospital Center in Joliet, Quebec. Now, this was the nearest hospital to where the tribe members' reserves were, so they often would go there for medical attention. She was having severe stomach pains at this point, and she needed help with those. Now, Joyce was used to being at the doctors and in hospitals because for the last 6 years, she had actually struggled with her health, and not many people knew because she would cover really well with her happiness, her joy, her cheery personality. But Joyce had heart complications in the past. It led her to having to have a pacemaker, and since then her health, kind of suffered because of that, and she was never fully healthy. The surgery had gone well, but it had been many years since then, and she also had type 2 diabetes at this time. Joyce always tried to inform new doctors and nurses that she was seeing of her pacemaker, of her diabetes, so there would be no miscommunications. But the problem was most of them spoke French or English, and she spoke her native language. She did know some words, and she would do her best to talk to them. And although she knew she couldn't communicate fully, she felt comfortable being there at first because there were medical records and there was stuff in plain French and English that they could look through. She had a medical bracelet she wore all the time that told them exactly what was wrong and how to treat her. And there was really no miscommunication, or there shouldn't have been. The hospital and the staff had methods to make sure that even those patients without the ability to communicate would still be given the proper care. However, that is the last thing they would do this time. 2 days later, Joyce was deceased, and her entire family would be mourning the loss of their wife and mother. Due to her health being rocky for so many years, it was extremely heartbreaking, yet not completely unusual. And so on August 28th, the world lost a beautiful soul. But this was not a health-related death. This was murder. You see, Joyce had a sister-in-law named Jemima, and she had gone to the hospital for a little bit to see Joyce, and then suddenly she was being ushered into the waiting room, the lobby area, and she was told that they needed to resuscitate Joyce because she had stopped breathing. Now, about an hour later, she was told that Joyce was deceased, and she ran out of the room. She had no idea how to take this. She was completely lost. She had just seen her, and everything was okay. But when they finally went to go see Joyce's body, she was covered in bruises. Now, her family and friends knew that Joyce was always recording. That is something that she did even at the hospital. But at the hospital, it wasn't for the same reason as keeping her children's memories. You see, she had to go live in order for people to tell her what the staff was talking about. They would never try to speak to her in her language. They would never try to communicate with her, try to get her to understand what they were saying. And so she felt comfortable only when she was recording, live streaming, and having her cousin tell her what they were saying. The day of her death, she had live streamed for 7 minutes, and Joyce was in pain. She was rocking back and forth. She was trying to get help, and you could hear her moaning and crying, and she was obviously uncomfortable. There was something very wrong. She needed more medication, or she needed some sort of assistance. And that's when you can hear staff talking to Joyce, and they were talking to her, talking amongst themselves, kind of as if they knew she couldn't really understand, so they were just hovering over her, talking at her. This is exactly why they felt like they could say whatever they wanted. So as Joyce recorded, her cousin heard these nurses basically saying that they believed she was acting stupid, and if she was done, they were asking her, "Are you done acting stupid?" And she could barely understand them at all. She couldn't. And so she just heard them yelling at her when she was in pain.
Joyce Echaquan put up this live video from her hospital bed yesterday. The mother of 7 calls out for help. The distress in her voice is obvious. You can hear other voices, too. Hospital staff insulting her.
Another nurse had come in and told Joyce that she made bad choices and that basically she shouldn't have her children see her like this, that she should be ashamed of that. Now, Joyce must have understood something about her children and them being talked about, because she ended up telling the nurse that's why she came. Joyce had also mentioned to another cousin that the hospital staff seemed to be fed up with her, like they were annoyed and they weren't treating her for her pain. She was saying that they were only making sure she was being quiet. They weren't caring about her pain, and Joyce had spoken in her native language on the live stream, saying that she was worried she had been given too much morphine, something that she was allergic to that was on her medical records not to give her. As she continued to call out and ask for help, the staff simply ignored her calls, and when they didn't show her any attention, she would scream louder for help. And then when they finally did, they were talking down to her as if she didn't matter, as if she didn't deserve help. And one of Joyce's cousins had told her that one of the nurses was actually saying that she was stupid, only good for sex, and a drain to the health system, and that the employees were paying for it. The last thing that she heard was that the staff were saying Joyce was better off dead. Her family believed that her death was a result of the morphine she was given to shut her up instead of to actually help her with the pain. This was without any regard to her medical records that they had access to. And as Joyce was sent in for an autopsy, the family was spreading the news within the Echaquan tribe, and also it was spreading throughout the country because her live stream had gone viral. Many were outraged, demanding that this was racism and this was against Indigenous people, that the reason she was killed was because of her being Indigenous. Before she passed, while Joyce was streaming and crying and asking for help, her children had actually seen this video. Her son was in school and he saw it, and her daughter was actually at home and tried rushing to the hospital. The receptionist refused to help Joyce's daughter when she got there, and when she finally found Joyce before she had passed away, her mother was pale and she was unresponsive. Her family, though, knew that this wasn't anything new for Indigenous people to be dealing with, and that's exactly why it was a problem. As many of you know, or I hope you know, Indigenous peoples have been mistreated since the Europeans discovered their land and had it promptly stolen from them. And now, like we discussed, tribes were torn apart, but not just by their murder. Also because for more than 100 years, the Canadian authorities took more than 150,000 children of Indigenous families away from their tribes and put them into white residential schools. This was to teach them how to survive in a white society and basically pull them away from all of their Indigenous culture and tribes and everything that made them who they were. These schools were run by churches and they were known for neglect and violence, and most believed that these were opened with the sole purpose of removing the Indian from the child. Indian children were left with shattered ideas of their culture and trauma with long-lasting effects. And that was if they survived. You see, Joyce's tribe, the Echaquan, they still remain today. They are alive, but even they have gone through so much in their history. They have been through so much suffering. I mean, for years they have been fighting to gain autonomy and sovereignty away from the Canadian government to respect their own history, because the Canadian government does not do that for them. And they have lost so much of their land due to the logging expeditions that wipe out the forests in order to make roads. Now, they have gone to the Canadian government. They have said, there are places that we would more than love for you to come and build roads. We want that too, but there are places that are our more valuable places, and you are cutting those down. And they have begged for them to listen to the different areas, that they are more than willing for them to come in their land and take down the trees. But nobody ever listens. The tribe began putting up roadblocks, making it clear that they would permit this no longer. However, only 3 years later, Quebec allowed a company to log on their land. And when they asked them to stop, they basically started working 24 hours a day because the Echaquan tribe was going to court. They were going to sue them. They were going to get them off their property. So they started working 24/7 to get it done before they could do anything legally. However, after they went through this process, the tribe was granted the ability to create the logging plan to avoid their more valuable areas, but this was only due to the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that protected 17% of the land by the year 2020. This was not legally binding. It's just made in hopes of eliminating human rights violations against the 370 million Indigenous people fighting discrimination every day. You see, land wasn't the only thing that these tribes were fighting for. Indigenous peoples were fighting for respect, for human decency, for safety, and still do today. You see those Indigenous children that were ripped away from their tribes and sent to these white residential schools? Well, thousands would be found dead. They would be found buried in the backyard of these schools, and there was no documentation of their death. One of the largest was the Kamloops Indian Residential School, which found 215 undocumented deaths in their own backyard. Some were as young as 3 years old, and their families, their Indian tribes, had no idea where their children had gone or that they died while attending school. They were not allowed to be anywhere near them. Many of these deaths were named by the schools to be due to disease or an accident, but we'll never be sure.
An investigation at a former boarding school for Indigenous children in Canada may have revealed a mass grave. Preliminary findings suggest the remains of 215 children could be buried at the Kamloops Indian Residential School. For decades, Canada's government forced Indigenous children to attend facilities like this one. Researchers have identified at least 4,100 children who died while attending these schools.
This was an investigation by the community itself, the First Nation where the school is located. They, in fact, did fundraising, and they first started looking. They knew from people who had attended these schools that there were children buried on the ground. So though there was widespread skepticism about these rumors broadly outside the Indigenous community. So they started looking about 20 years ago and had no luck. I mean, this school dates back to the 19th century. A lot of the grounds were overgrown. It's been abandoned for a long time. But recently they brought in a new technology, ground penetrating radar. And just over a week ago, they received a preliminary report with the horrific news that there were the remains of 215 former students, some as young as 3. And the scanning is still going on. They anticipate finding even more remains.
It has been a long history of mistreatment for Indigenous people, and although some has changed and many have spoken out, like the Prime Minister of Canada, who made a statement apologizing for the shameful chapter of the country's history, the trauma remains.
Saying that we are sorry today is not enough. It will not erase the loneliness you have felt. It will not undo the harm you have suffered. It will not bring back the languages and traditions that you have lost. It will not take away the isolation and vulnerability you felt when separated from your families, communities, and cultures. It will not repair the hardships you endured in the years that followed as you struggled to recover from what you experienced in the schools and move forward with your lives. But today, I'm here to tell you, on behalf of the Government of Canada and of all Canadians, that this burden is one that you no longer have to carry alone. The treatment of Indigenous children in residential schools is a painful chapter of Canada's history that we must acknowledge and confront.
In fact, as recent as 2016, 52% of children in foster care in Canada were taken away from Indigenous families. It is said that there is so much loss of their children for no other reason than the color of their skin. This is just the same way that Joyce was ripped away from her own family. And due to all of this outrage, the hospital was forced to begin an internal review. At the same time, Joyce's autopsy revealed that she had died of a pulmonary edema or excess fluid in the lungs linked to a rare heart condition. However, the coroner named Camille believed that the medical staff assumed Joyce was in opioid withdrawal with no evidence to back that up and ignored all of her symptoms, and that she could have been saved. As Joyce was trying to tell them about her heart palpitations, they believed it was from drugs. Camille concluded that her diagnosis was based on prejudice and that she was not properly diagnosed. She was not properly monitored, and she even said if Joyce was white, she would still be alive today. That as soon as she entered that hospital, a label was placed on her, one that killed her.
It's written in black and white in my report, the word systemic racism, because the case of Miss Echaquan, that's exactly what happened. And the day that we can name the word, this is what happened in this case here, and she's not the only one to go through it. I think by identifying it, we will have made a big step.
However, the Quebec premier claimed that he was shocked by her treatment, but this was not an example of systemic racism, that the entire health system couldn't be racist. He just couldn't accept that.
Quebec Premier François Legault Tuesday said he agreed that Echaquan was subjected to prejudice, discrimination, and racism at the Joliette Hospital, but maintained that systemic racism does not exist in the province.
Joyce's family decided to file a lawsuit against this hospital, and their lawyer said that it was clear she was not listened to. I mean, they had video footage, and her husband, Carhall, said that he wanted to change the system that discriminates against Indigenous families, and so even though it was hard, he was going to fight. He said that due to her having so many children, she was also discriminated against prior to that. One of the most beautiful things about her children, and the fact that she was this Indigenous woman, was used against her. At a press conference, Carhall said she spent her final days in agony, surrounded by people who held her in contempt, people who were supposed to protect her. He was in tears as he explained that he had gotten so many condolences, but no answers, and he wasn't even able to tell her that he loved her for the last time. Now, like I said, this live stream that was from Joyce went viral not only in Canada, but all over the world, and the Canadian government were basically forced to launch 3 investigations into the hospital, the staff, and her treatment. Now, you can find many statistics even online, just a simple Google search, saying that Indigenous peoples have lower life expectancy and higher rates of chronic diseases. They have an average life expectancy of 70 to 75 years compared to 82 years for those of us who are white. Their infant mortality rate is also 2 times higher. They have altogether very poor health, and that's not due to lack of them going to get help. That's due to lack of being able to be treated how they deserved. The next year, this lawsuit was brought to the courtroom, and 4 weeks went by of testimony from witnesses, healthcare workers, and Indigenous leaders. Carhall was finding it very difficult to make out what was true and what wasn't, because there were so many different opinions on this case and so many different health workers that denied that this was about race at all. But there was one witness who said that a month before Joyce's death, when she was at the hospital, again for different health things, a witness had heard Joyce being mistreated by the hospital staff. And she was actually a woman named Joyce who was there helping take care of her father, who was in the hospital, when she heard Joyce screaming and expressing concerns about what they were doing. And so Jennifer basically said that the staff were ignoring Joyce and were very verbally aggressive. So she went over to see if maybe she could help, that there was anything she could do. And she was told by staff to mind her own business. Joyce's family testified that the month that she passed away, that she did not want to go to the hospital because she had been mistreated so many times before, and that she was abused and insulted by the staff. She was over-medicated and restrained when she needed help. She said she was also pressured by the same hospital to have abortions. She was also sterilized at a different hospital the same year without her consent. Her husband was unable to be there for any of her hospital visits, even though he was concerned about her because of the pandemic, and due to them not allowing any guests inside, she was on her own. Joyce's brother said that he'd never thought he'd see a member of his family being tied up like an animal, because she was every single time tied up to the bed like she was the person in the wrong. Another witness came forward claiming that she was actually in a stretcher right next to Joyce when Joyce started yelling, "You're letting me die, I will die, I will die." But she was never mean to the staff. She was just panicked at that point. She believed she was going to die. And the witness said that 4 nurses came over and began laughing. Another witness was visiting her daughter in the hospital when she heard staff members talking about Joyce, who was in the next room, saying, "We're paying for her. And she's Indian. It doesn't matter." When she finally passed, this witness heard them say, "Finally, we have some peace. She's dead." Now, when the nurse who was supposed to be taking care of Joyce testified, she claimed that she was overworked. She was stressed, that due to the pandemic, she was angry with her situation and her workload, and that they had to work like slaves. The nurse's name was actually banned from publication, so I have no idea what her name is, but this was said to be because she was getting death threats at this time. She admitted to finding Joyce recording her and stopping the recording, but she also apologized to Joyce's family.
Le fait qu'ils sont fatigués, surtaxés.
The chief of Manawan, where Echaquan was from, says there's no excuse for the nurse's words. That nurse also testified that her supervisor's response to the video was to assure the nurse that she wouldn't be recognized.
After having heard these horrific comments, her only concern was as to whether the nurse would be recognizable or not. No concern whatsoever for the patient's well-being. And that is absolutely terrible, because that goes to show the kind of management culture that allows these problems to be created.
The doctor who saw Joyce testified that he believed Joyce was going through an opioid withdrawal as well, and that he had scheduled a colonoscopy for her to figure out what was causing her stomach pains. An emergency physician at another hospital who came in to examine this case testified saying that on the day of her death, she was likely in a coma and was left for at least 11 minutes without being monitored, and that is how she passed away. Now, the staff tried to say that Joyce was a very angry woman when she got to the hospital. She was begging for morphine, and this didn't make any sense because she knew she was allergic to that, and that is the last thing that she would have wanted. It was much more likely that she was trying to tell them, "I'm allergic to the morphine, don't give me morphine," and she was trying to speak to them when they weren't listening. It was revealed that the nurse had been fired the day after Joyce's death, and the orderly with her was also fired as well. These two were not charged with anything. None of the staff there were ever charged with what they had done. The coroner said, "To the children and friends of Joyce and to the community, thank you for your courage. Thank you for your resilience, your strength. You must tell your children, Carol, that the revolution of reconciliation began because of their mother." Carol said it's an impossible story to tell his children. It's a story based on a nightmare, on lies. He asked the courtroom when he was speaking to them if they would be able to accept telling the story to their own children if it happened to them. Many came together from all over the country to march for Joyce, and they had Justice for Joyce signs. And the Echaquan tribe actually created Joyce's principle after this in hopes that this would be adopted by Quebec. However, they have been turned down twice, and Joyce's principle is literally just to make the whole health system better for Indigenous peoples. That's all it asks for. It's a guarantee that Indigenous people will have access to health and social services without discrimination, and to have the tribe feel a sense of belonging. They also wanted the Canadian premier, who had previously denied systemic racism in the health system, to admit it, and he repeatedly has denied.
Quebec insists it's addressing the issue in stages, but they're not bowing to pressure from the United Nations to adopt Joyce's principle, the health plan named for the mother of 7.
L'Assemblée nationale adhère au principe de Joyce.
Greg Kelly, a Liberal Party MNA, pushed for the principle several times, always with the same result.
Y a-t-il consentement pour débattre de cette motion?
Pas de consentement, Monsieur le Président.
Pas de consentement.
But I'm just still a little bit, bewildered by how hard-headed the government is on this. The government always says, well, we want to do things in collaboration with you, and we want to work with you. So then after the Echaquan Nation does their own consultation, they come up with recommendations on how Quebec can fix their healthcare system. The government says, well, thank you. We acknowledge the, tabling of this report, but we're going to do it our own way anyway. So again, I think it's just old attitudes coming to the surface that the government knows best, and they'll fix the problems. But again, thank you very much for your contribution to the discussion.
For 2 weeks, members of this tribe and many other tribes came forward telling their own horror stories of the health system and how horribly they have been treated. And that is only a fraction of the people who have actually been mistreated. Even I could find multiple bad reviews on Yelp about this hospital and hospitals in the area, calling out their racist behavior. Indigenous people have posted about not being believed, especially women, and another post said that she wasn't even given the basic standard of care. Quebec has since revealed that they want to open an Indigenous health center with cultural training for employees and tribe members on the board. They are also trying to hire more from the tribe to work at the hospital where Joyce had passed from. But this isn't something that just happens to people in Canada and Quebec. This is something that happens to people all over the world, and there is so little done to make sure that no discrimination is happening. Hall often writes about his wife on Facebook, saying, "You were the first to tell me I was handsome, my best partner. We did everything together. You are who you were, smiling, beautiful. Will there be a day or a night, a moment to see you? Why is it in my dreams I can? Why not everywhere? I'll be yours forever, Joyce. You're already waiting for me." Her children will never get to grow up and share their experiences with the mother who adored them. All they have left is the memories she kept, the memories she recorded. This is such a recent case, but I wanted to cover this because, people want to say, yeah, we mistreated them in the past, but, it's gotten better today. This is proof that it hasn't. This happened in 2020, 2 years ago now. This is systemic racism, whether Quebec or Canada want to admit it or not, whether anybody all over the world does. If you have not gone through it like an Indigenous person has, you cannot say it is not systemic racism. You're not allowed, because you're not the one suffering. If you would like to read the full document about Joyce's principle that the Echaquan tribe came out with and really put their heart and soul into, I will link it below. I found the document that explains it all, and unfortunately they have been denied every single time they try to put this into effect. I will link that down below, but I will also put a link down to support it if I can find one, any sort of links to either donate or to sign petitions or anything like that. Being a nurse, being in the health system, empathy should be the #1 priority when hiring. It doesn't matter whether you're overworked. It doesn't matter whether you hate your job, you hate your life. You can still be a kind person. You can still treat someone with decency. You can still believe them when you have no evidence not to. They looked at her and they saw a woman who was a drug addict, a woman who was insane, rather than a woman who had survived so much and was just asking for help. So don't ever forget to speak up. Your voice is powerful enough, and I love you to absolute pieces.